There's this quiet tension that a lot of us live with. It's not some big crisis, but it's there, kind of like a low hum in the background of our lives. It's that feeling that there's a gap between who we are right now and who we feel we could be. We sense there's more potential in us, but we get caught in these comfortable routines that keep it just out of reach. In today's Daily Book Insight, we're going to dive into a book that doesn't just talk about this tension, it grabs it and confronts it head on. That book is Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. Right off the bat, this book forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. You know that feeling when you've hit your absolute limit in a workout, on a tough project, or just at the end of a long day? What if that feeling of being done isn't a wall? What if it's just a false boundary that your own mind has created? Goggins suggests that the exact moment your brain tells you to stop is actually the real starting line for growth. It's a challenging thought for sure, and it's the foundation of his entire philosophy. This quote just captures the whole premise of the book in its rawest form. It's not a gentle piece of advice. It's a pretty stark warning. It argues that the biggest danger we face isn't failure or hardship. It's living a life so far inside our comfort zones that we never even find out what we're capable of. This isn't meant to be some feel-good motivation. It's meant to set the stage for the hard work that he talks about next. Now, to really get the intensity of this book, you kind of have to understand the man who wrote it. Today, David Goggins is known as a retired Navy SEAL and an elite endurance athlete. But his story doesn't start with strength. It starts with incredible hardship. We're talking a childhood of horrific abuse, poverty, and prejudice. That led to him becoming an overweight pest exterminator who was just struggling with insecurity and feeling pretty hopeless. His whole philosophy was born out of that radical, self-driven transformation. So why does this book matter beyond all the extreme stories? Well, because hidden underneath the ultramarathons and the grueling military training, there's a manual for building mental resilience. And let's be really clear about our goal here. It's not to become David Goggins. Not at all. It's to carefully pull out the psychological principles that we can adopt to build our own resilient mental operating systems without having to run 100 miles. We're going to separate the timeless ideas from his extreme persona. So here's how we're going to do that. We'll look at 4 of his core ideas. We'll start with the foundation of any change, facing the uncomfortable truth. Then we'll get into how to actively build resilience by what he calls forging a calloused mind. After that, we'll break down his most famous concept, the 40% rule. And finally, we'll see how to turn failure into a strategic blueprint for what to do next. All right, this first principle is, I think, the most difficult. It demands something we're all pretty much conditioned to avoid, just brutal, unflinching honesty. Goggins' whole argument is that no real change can happen until we stop telling ourselves the comfortable lies we've built up about where we are in life. Real progress, he says, starts with a clear-eyed look at where you actually stand, no matter how much it might sting. And his first tool for this is the accountability mirror. And this isn't some metaphor, it's a literal physical practice of confronting your unfiltered self. The reason this works, psychologically, is that it takes all those internal stories and excuses, the ones that let us stay put, and it puts them out in the open. By making your weaknesses and goals tangible, visible things, you totally disrupt that quiet voice that says, "I'll start tomorrow," or "it's not so bad." You're creating an objective inventory of your life that you just can't ignore. So the process is simple, but it is not easy. First, you stand in front of a mirror alone. Second, you write your truths on sticky notes, being brutally honest about your weaknesses, the excuses you always use, and the goals you say you want. Third, you stick them on the mirror. And finally, you face them every single day. What this does is it transforms a simple mirror into an active command center for your life, a place where the gap between what you say and what you do is staring you right in the face. Okay, now, here's a really critical distinction that a lot of people miss. The point of this is not to shame yourself. This is where the idea gets misapplied all the time. Goggins argues that this raw confrontation is the very first act of taking your power back. See, shame just paralyzes you. It makes you want to hide. But acknowledgement, seeing things exactly as they are, that's what empowers you. It gives you a real starting point. After all, you can't change what you refuse to look at. So once you've confronted your reality, the next step is to build the mental toughness to actually change it. Goggins calls this callousing the mind. And it's a process of intentionally and repeatedly stepping into discomfort. The whole idea is to treat your mental resilience not as something you're born with, but as a muscle that you build through practice.
Think about it this way. When you do physical work, your hands develop calluses to protect them, right? Well, your minds can develop resilience in the exact same way, through voluntary hardship. Our brains are hardwired for comfort and efficiency, which is great for survival, but pretty terrible for growth. The comfort zone, it feels safe, but it leads to stagnation. Real growth, adaptation, and resilience, they only happen in that zone of productive discomfort. So the goal is to deliberately and strategically spend a little more time on the right side of this chart.
And look, this doesn't mean you have to do anything extreme. The principle can be applied in small daily ways. Each of these is a low-friction way to introduce a little voluntary discomfort. The power isn't in the action itself. Taking the stairs isn't going to change your life. The power is in the decision. It's a small vote you cast for a version of yourself that doesn't just automatically take the easy way out. It's about consistently choosing a tiny productive friction until your mind's baseline for what's hard starts to shift. And this really highlights a key insight for me. Real mental strength isn't built in some dramatic overhaul. A single heroic effort makes for a great story, but it's usually not sustainable. It's the quiet consistency of these small daily frictions, that unglamorous discipline that truly rewires how we respond to hardship. It builds a genuine foundation of resilience that's there for you when life throws you a real, unavoidable challenge. This practice of callousing your mind leads us right into Goggins' most famous idea. Because as you start to intentionally face discomfort, you begin to realize that your perceived limits, they were never as solid as you thought. And this is the core of what he calls the 40% rule. The rule is a simple but really profound statement. When your mind is telling you that you are completely done, that you have absolutely nothing left in the tank and you can't possibly go on, you are actually only at about 40% of your true capacity. There's a whole other 60% reserve that you haven't even touched. That voice in your head screaming stop is what Goggins calls the governor. And this actually lines up with a concept in sports science called the central governor theory, which basically says our brain acts like a protective mechanism. It sends out fatigue and pain signals to make us stop long before we reach our true physical limits. It's a survival instinct. Goggins' rule is a mental framework for consciously overriding that instinct, arguing that it's just set way too conservatively for the lives we live today. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand this. Accessing that extra 60% is not like flipping a switch. This is another area where these ideas get misunderstood or even dangerously misapplied. It's a gradual process. You push just a little past your perceived limit, maybe to 45%. And by doing that, you set a new baseline. You teach your mind with direct evidence that its old limits were just an illusion. It's all about incremental expansion, not one reckless leap. This is a tool for challenging self-imposed limits, not for ignoring real physical injury or deep burnout. So, what happens when you push past your 40% and you still fail? Because if you're constantly seeking discomfort, failure is going to happen. And this leads us to the final critical piece of Goggins' system, a strategy for not just getting through failure, but for systematically mining it for intelligence. Without this part, the other ideas are kind of incomplete. He uses a tool from the military called the After Action Report, or AAR. The whole process is designed to take the emotion out of failure. First, you document exactly what happened, step by step, just the facts. Second, you analyze what went right and what went wrong with total precision. Third, you pull out specific, actionable lessons. And fourth, and this is the most critical step, you immediately schedule your next attempt. This stops you from wallowing in it and turns failure from a painful dead end into a structured, data-rich learning opportunity. This just completely reframes what failure means. It stops being this emotional thing to be afraid of, and instead becomes a strategic tool to be used. It gives you the best data you can possibly get because it shows you the exact gaps in your preparation, your strategy, or your execution. In this model, failure stops being an indictment of who you are and just becomes a blueprint for your next try. As we wrap up here, it's worth coming back to our original goal. The power of these ideas isn't about becoming an extreme athlete or a Navy SEAL. It's in the realization that we have so much more control than we often think. The core message is that you do not have to be a passive victim of your circumstances, your past, or even the comfortable stories that your own mind tells you. So, here is your one action for this week. Not some grand gesture, but a small, private test of these ideas. Choose one small, voluntary friction. Take the stairs. Wake up 15 minutes earlier and just sit with the discomfort. Make that one phone call you've been putting off. Don't post about it. Don't even tell anyone. Just quietly, consistently, do it. Because if there's one thing worth remembering, real growth begins when an idea is quietly applied, not loudly admired. If this insight gave you a new perspective on your own limits, consider liking and subscribing to Daily Book Insight for more deep dives into powerful ideas. And to help you put these concepts into practice, you can download our free action plan, which has a structured guide for using the accountability mirror and choosing your own daily frictions. Thank you for your time.